Hello, everyone. I'm Anna Barker, and this is our second Zoom dedicated to Stendhal's The Red and the Black. And this is my English copy. This is the one that I used for the 50 days of our rush through the gloriousness of Stendhal. And I keep referring to my Russian grandmother who collected French novels in Russian. So this was the book that I read at 16. I have a 15-volume set of Stendhal in Russian. And The Red and the Black is so important in the arc of Stendhal's life's narrative that in the Russian edition, the 15-volume edition, The Red and the Black is in volume 1, even though it wasn't his first novel, but it is the most important novel that he wrote. This is what he's known for. So this is the volume that I read when I was 16. And I will try to maybe in the Zoom cover some more stuff that we didn't get a chance to discuss while we were rushing through The Red and the Black. I made a few notes. I want to talk about some of the other books that Stendhal wrote, and some of them are very important to our understanding who Stendhal was. And of course, it's his pseudonym. Remember, I started commenting on the beginnings of chapters, which are these made up lines, often made up lines from books. And he just sort of makes up lines and attributes them to people like Byron and Machiavelli. It's amazing to what extent we know Stendhal, but we don't know Stendhal. He took his name from the German town of Stendhal, where the German art historian Winkelmann was born. And art history and archaeology played a huge part in Stendhal's life. He loved Italy so much more than he loved France. He was just one of those 19th century Frenchmen who felt that France is so bogus during the time of Restoration, that he preferred Italy, where everything was just a little more natural for him, a little more wild, a little more earnest. And this phoniness of Restoration was something that both he and Balzac exposed in his novels. And remember, we talked about Balzac, and we just wrote a tiny little slimmer of a book. I mean, this is like pathetic because my grandmother's collected works of Balzac is 24 volumes. And we just read one of the shortest and most infamous and amazing books from his Human Comedy. And Stendhal's writing is not as extensive as Balzac's, because Stendhal was not necessarily a professional writer. I mentioned in some of my commentary that he was an auditor for the French army, and he was working in the French army administration at the time when Napoleon invaded Russia. So Stendhal saw the burning Moscow firsthand. And then he returned to France, and only in Paris he found out of the tremendous defeat of the entirety of the French army. He actually crossed the Berezina River, and those of you who read War and Peace with me, you remember the final chapters of volume 4, where there's chaos, just absolute chaos, and the slaughter of the French army as they're crossing the Berezina River. And Stendhal crossed the Berezina River because he found a ford that was much more usable than the pontoon bridges that failed Napoleon so spectacularly during the exit from Russia. And he found out about it too late. You read all of War and Peace. Yes, all of War and Peace. That has a lot of Napoleon in it. And you read all of The Red and the Black, and that has a tremendous amount of Napoleon in it. Julien Sorel's life is impossible without references to Stendhal, to Napoleon. And Napoleon was this figure in Stendhal's life who was inspirational, but also damning. And you can see how this notion of Napoleon's greatness and collapse is integral to our understanding of Julien Sorel. Stendhal actually wrote a biography of Napoleon, and he dedicated a big chunk of his life. I wrote down the dates somewhere. He wrote the life of Napoleon in 1817, 1818. So that's about 12, 13 years before he wrote The Red and the Black. And it wasn't published until 1929. So Stendhal's notion of who Napoleon was and what he represented to him was not available for 100 years after he wrote and published The Red and the Black. And so reading Stendhal's biography of Napoleon alongside reading The Red and the Black would be very useful for us readers in the 21st century, because readers for 100 years would just see The Red and the Black as an extension of Stendhal's ideas about Napoleon, and they did not have the benefit of Stendhal's biography of Napoleon for 100 years. And what else did Stendhal do was his lovely century. He also wrote The Life of Rossini. You probably noticed how often he references opera in The Red and the Black. Characters go to the opera. In his last famous novel, Charterhouse of Parma, La Scala figures prominently. Characters go to the opera there as well. He mentions Mozart a great deal. Cherubino, one of the characters of Mozart, is sort of the dual character to Julien Sorel in book 1 of The Red and the Black, because of his constant fooling around with garden ladders and jumping out of windows, and that reference starts occurring very, very early on in his relationship with Madame de Renal. So he wrote a biography of Rossini. He worshipped Mozart and Rossini, and he was an avid opera consumer. And he was in love with Italy. As a matter of fact, he wrote a fabulous travelogue, and he wrote it around the same time as he was working on his biography of Napoleon. It's called Rome, Naples, and Florence. And that is still in print. I actually have a modern edition of Rome, Naples, and Florence. And I just would like to sometime have enough time and actually go to Italy and read Stendhal's ideas about these three cities on location. That would be just, a 16-year-old kid's dreams come true. Stendhal actually sets his last famous novel, The Charterhouse of Parma, in Italy, and you can see references to Italy often enough in even in the Red and the Black. That country just appealed to him, and he actually moved to Italy and lived in Milan a great part of his life. And then when do you remember I posted a very long note on all of the regime changes in France, starting in 1789, and then on and on and on, all the way to today's Fifth French Republic. Stendhal's life covers a lot of those changes because he's born in Grenoble, and he's born during the time of the Bourbon monarchy. And then, of course, he lives through the Revolution, he lives through the Reign of Terror, he lives through the Directory, he lives through Napoleon being first consul of France, he lives through Napoleon's emperorhood and the First French Empire, and then the restoration of the Bourbon. So he sees the Bourbon fall twice in, well, depending on how you count. 1789 is the Revolution, but the king is sort of still the figurehead of this, whatever it was, whatever France was, until his arrest and beheading in 1793. And then he sees the Bourbon fall again during the July Revolution of 1830. And it's just amazing. Like, you can feel France on the cusp of explosion at the end of The Red and the Black. The novel is published, and a few months later, the revolution happens. That's the astonishing thing about this novel. So those of you who will stay with French reading all the way through the fall, I mean, this is Les Miserables of Victor Hugo. It's another 1,300-page novel, and we will try to read 2 1,300-page novels in the next 6 months. Lucky us. It's so fabulous to write an entire 1,300-page novel about the Revolution of 1830 and publish it in 1862. To anticipate it before it happens is nothing short of just some kind of understanding of your times and the anxiety of everyone around you. And Stendhal understood it almost viscerally. And so the astonishing thing about Stendhal is he sees the Bourbon fall a second time. And those of you who will be reading The Count of Monte Cristo with me, we start on Wednesday, you will realize that the Bourbon fell 3 times. There was that one brief interlude when Napoleon comes back for 100 days. And Napoleon's return for those 100 days is a huge part of the very beginning of The Count of Monte Cristo. And it really changes the life of the characters of the novel irreversibly. And so he sees the Bourbon fall 3 times. And with the July monarchy, he all of a sudden becomes an administrator again. So he was an administrator in the bureaucratic machine of Napoleon the First of the First Empire, and then he works for the administration of a king named Louis Philippe. And I will really have to post a post about Louis Philippe as we start reading the Count of Monte Cristo, because Louis Philippe, the novel ends during the reign of Louis Philippe. And at that point, Stendhal becomes a bureaucrat again. He becomes a French consul to Civitavecchia, which is the port city that serves Rome, and to Trieste. And it's fascinating that Trieste is under Austrian rule at this point. And those of you who read my notes from a long time ago about the Congress of Vienna, the foreign minister of the Habsburg Austrians was Prince Metternich. And Prince Metternich did not want to certify Stendhal's appointment as a consul to Trieste, which was under Austrian rule then, because he felt that he is such a godless liberal. So Stendhal gets into a bit of political trouble with the very conservative Habsburg Austrians. And as a matter of fact, that really puts an end to his literary career, because he is, a minor official in the administration of the July monarchy. And so he can't express his personal views as freely as he did when he was a public citizen. And so it's fascinating. There is a book that he writes during this time period. And this book is called Lucien Leven. And those of you who want to fill in the gap between The Red and the Black and the Charterhouse of Parma, it's a book that he writes in 1835. So he's a consul at this point, but he feels that he cannot publish it because his personal and artistic views would clash with his stated public official persona. And it's fascinating to what extent Lucien Leven is the extension of Julien Sorel into the post-1830 revolution. He is kicked out of a university because he participates in a student protest. He actually goes to the funeral of General Lamarck. And so this character, Lucien Leven, that Stendhal creates, and the novel was never published during his lifetime, is dismissed from the university, and he goes through several various complex reinventions of himself. He has problematic relationship with his father. And it's fascinating that eventually in this version of the extension of Julien Sorel into the post-revolution of 1830 French period, he becomes a secretary to a government minister. So definitely you can hear reverberations of Julien Sorel. And then one more book that I wanted to mention. So I talked about his travelogues. I talked about his biographies. Let me just give you the titles of his other novels. He writes Armance, and that was published 3 years before The Red and the Black. So Armance in 1827, Red and the Black 1830, Lucien Leven, he writes it in the 1830s, but never publishes. And then it's amazing, he publishes, he does not publish, he starts writing a book about Prussian heiress whose name is Minna, and she wants to figure out what love is. And she moves to Paris, and there is a fascinating young man who is interested in her, and he studies the map of Prussia first to discover her roots. And at that point, the novel sort of ends. The title of the novel is The Pink and the Green. So there's the red and the black, and there's the pink and the green. And so it's a story of this Prussian aristocrat named Minna who comes to Paris, and that's where the novel ends. Don't you just wish he would have finished that novel? It would have been so fascinating. And then Charterhouse of Parma, 1839. And I can't recommend it enough. I will be making frequent references to that novel when we get to the part of Les Miserables where two of the characters encounter each other on the battlefield of Waterloo in 1815. So 1815 is kind of a very important year in French history. And even though Les Miserables deals with the revolution of 1830, the characters have a prehistory, and that prehistory is in the Napoleonic period. So the Charterhouse of Parma sends one of the characters to observe the Battle of Waterloo. And it sort of becomes the defining moment of in this character's life. And then there's this odd, absolutely strange and miraculous and mysterious book. And I love the cover of this book. I hope you can see it. There are sketches of human faces, and it's Stendhal's autobiography, still in print today. And it's called The Life of Henry Brulard. He invents another name for himself, even when he's writing his own autobiography. He wrote it also during that time when he was the consul for Louis Philippe in Civitavecchia and in Trieste, but it wasn't published till 1890, decades after he died. And he starts the novel in Rome, and he's lying right away. I mean, he starts his autobiography in Rome, and he's lying right away. He's saying, you know, there I was standing amidst the ruins of Rome that I've seen so many times, and they've been so transfigured over the decades that I've been observing these rules, and I'm 50 and I need to reflect on my life. So lies upon lies upon lies. He starts the biography when he's 52. He didn't start thinking about writing his biography in the middle of the Roman ruins. But then he does one amazing thing, and this is what I just want to mention before we start talking about the red and the black. He says that, you know, biographies of famous men are all about their, you know, public events and, you know, childhood, and then a bit of youth, and then education, and then all of the amazing things that they've accomplished at the prime of their lives. He says, no, I'm going to write the biography of my love affairs. I'm going to write my biography through the women I love. And Stendhal loved women all the way to getting syphilis in 1808. So this is an author who writes all of his greatest books while suffering grossly, grotesquely, not just from syphilis, but from the treatment that he was getting. No antibiotics till we pretty much get to World War II, right? So venereal diseases are treated with crazy things like mercury and mercury vapors and arsenic. And his treatment involved taking iodine and quicksilver, and it made him extremely sick. Just imagine like swollen lymph glands and inability, like joint stiffness. There were times where he couldn't even hold a pen. And so 1808, he died in, let's see, did I write his? Yes, he died in 1842. So bulk of his adult life, he was suffering from syphilis and the side effects of the treatment. Not a happy man, but it's amazing that even at this moment where he decides to be honest about himself, he invents a fictional name for himself again. He lies about why he starts writing this novel or his autobiography. It's a novel, you know, like, do we trust Stendhal to tell us anything truthful ever? No. And that's why we love him, because he is Quicksilver, right? He's like an extension of his treatment. He slips through our fingers. And he's just so enigmatic all the way to the end. The end of the novel is crushing and insane. And I'm not going to mention what happens at the end. Those of you who finished know, but it is quite possibly the most insane ending of any novel I've ever read. I gave you little reverberations of The Tale of Two Cities of Dickens. And yes, he read The Red and the Black. Dostoevsky and Tolstoy read The Red and the Black. Everyone read the Red and the Black. That's why I was so pleased that some of you actually finished the novel, because it's sort of the text of the 19th century. Between Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, all of the wild poems of Lord Byron, who is not read today at all. It's just not at all. And I adore him. You know, just like the pilgrimage, Charles Harold's Pilgrimage, Don Juan, Manfred, all of those just absolutely enthusiastically insane poems about male journeys. And so The Sorrows of Young Werther is a sort of a Bildungsroman, very early work by Goethe. He's in his 20s when he writes it. He sort of wanted to distance himself from writing it later on in his life, but it was so influential that when Napoleon and his army will enter Weimar, he will actually have a conversation with Goethe, and he will say to Goethe, I read your Sorrows of Young Werther 7 times, just in a row. And then over all this hovers the figure of Napoleon. So these are the books that inspired and ignited 19th century imagination. And all of these books talked about the evolution of a male character. That's why I would have loved to see Stendhal finish The Pink and the Green, because the protagonist of the novel was a woman. But despite the fact that we have a male character and the evolution, and Bildungsroman is a novel of the sort of the evolution of a character from youth into adulthood. One of the most famous Bildungsromans of the 20th century is The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man of James Joyce. So we have this evolution of a character into from teenagehood into sort of an adulthood. I mean, he dies so young. Despite the fact that we have this evolution of a male character, it's a very female-centered book. So do you remember that portrait of this enigmatic young woman tying her satin slipper and gazing at the viewers so incredibly boldly? I chose that painting because it reminded me of Matilda. And guess what? Stendhal was madly in love with a Polish countess whose name was Matilda Dębowska. What is it was French authors who fall in love with Polish countesses. Do you remember the wild story of Balzac and how he got this fan letter from Ewelina Ganska and started correspondence that lasted for decades? And, you know, Ewelina's husband died, but she still couldn't marry Balzac because there was the matter of inheritance, and she wanted to make sure that her daughter gets the title and the whole inheritance. So had to wait till her daughter got married, and then, you know, she finally marries Balzac, and he dies 4 months later. So, you know, it's sort of like one of those unusual cases of a French author being killed by a marriage. So, but she was a Polish countess, and it's amazing because Stendhal had this unrequited love affair with a Polish countess whose name was Matilda. So the character of Matilda de la Mole is very much though influenced by the longing that Stendhal had for an enigmatic and unapproachable woman whose name was Matilda Countess Dębowska. About the novel, and I suppose I should mention one more book that Stendhal wrote that reveals us another little secret about him. He wrote this nonfiction treatise called On Love, and it was published in 1822, I believe. So he wrote it before he wrote The Red and the Black. And he talks about love as the psychological state that human beings subject themselves to because they want to reveal to themselves what it means to be the other human being. And he talks about like the stages of falling in love. And if you read this treatise on love that Stendhal wrote, you will see to what extent the relationship between Julien and Madame de Renal and Julien and Matilda are very much though the following the stages of falling in love that Stendhal praised so much in human beings. And it's about seeing yourself in the other human being. It's about extending yourself into another human being. It's about willing to disregard who you are in order to see yourself in the other human being. And I just mentioned all of these things so easily and effortlessly. And I just mentioned the things that are impossible, right? Can we extend ourselves into another human being? No, because we're so selfish and we are so self-possessed and self-absorbed. Can we extend ourselves into another human being? No, because we value these superbly important borders that we create around ourselves. And Stendhal sort of felt that this infatuation with another human being starts with us noting that, oh, so that's how this human being does it. You know, that's how she picks up a flower, or, oh, well, that's how she ties her bonnet. I mean, those of you who read Anna Karenina at one point, and remember, we are slugging through all of these French novels and perhaps one or two English novels a year from now, because we really want to give Anna Karenina true credit. There'll be a character there. God, I'm going to start crying right now. Anna Karenina is amazing. There's a character there who sees a woman tie a bonnet, and he says to himself, you know, there's that one, and there are all the other women. And Do you see how much Tolstoy learned from Stendhal? So there's that moment where we see that other human being and we just sort of note mentally, oh, that's how they do this something. And then we start searching in ourselves for something that that person who does that one thing thusly would find fascinating in ourselves. And do you remember that strutting French rooster that I posted? You know, Julien is so young, so inexperienced. He read the Bible. That's how he knows about relationships between men and women. And then, of course, his friend Fouquet, who has had very, from what we understand about this character, he has had very unsatisfying relationships with women. So that's the totality of Julien's knowledge about women. And so he has so little to recommend to Madame de Renal, he thinks, but for her, he is the extension of all the dreams she never thought she had. And plus, he is so incredibly attractive. You have to understand that the thing about Julien Sorel is he is so stunningly beautiful, just physically attractive as a young man, that women turn their heads on the street. That brief moment when he enters the tavern in Besançon, and Amanda, who is at the bar, notices him, and it's like, you know, that's the guy. and then she says, oh darn, I wish you would be going to law school instead of the seminary. But Julien and Madame de Renal is just this relationship that could not have happened, should not have happened, and it gratifies both of them immensely through things that they didn't realize they lacked in life. And Madame de Renal she just loses her head completely. She's this level-headed, incredibly accomplished woman. And that's the thing about Stendhal. And that's why I chose that beautiful woman painting, painted by a woman in 18th century France, to represent Stendhal's commitment to creating women characters who have so much agency. It's fascinating. Both Madame de Renal and Matilda are the first to make the move, because they find Julien incredibly attractive. And their obsession with Julien is precipitated by the fact that they perceive a rival. So the servant girl who actually propositions Julien, she's like, I have money, I saved up some money, and I expect an inheritance from an aunt. And hey, you know, and she goes to her confessor and she's like, I want to propose a business venture to Monsieur Julien Sorel. He's cute and I can support him. I mean, it's just so incredibly charming. And so the servant girl, and of course, you know, then Madame de Renal realizes that her servant is all of a sudden propositioning the young man, the tutor in her family, and Madame de Renal looks at him completely differently. All of a sudden he becomes something that she could have, but she may lose because he may become completely unavailable. And it's the same with Matilda. She sees Julien, and from the first moment, he just looks so different from all of the fops that surround her. You know, all of these young men who are titled, wealthy, privileged, and empty for Matilda. And she sees Julien, she projects her romantic aspirations for someone who could transcend her times onto Julien, but she doesn't become possessive and obsessive about him until Julien, I'm sorry, I'm going to start laughing so hard, until he encounters that Russian prince who explains, this is hilarious. A French young man learns about the art of seduction and how to make a woman jealous enough to the point of complete infatuation from a Russian prince who tells him, yeah, there's this 10-step program. You just start writing these letters and you don't have to mean it. Just find a woman who is plausibly, conceivably an object of your affections. And he finds a woman who is conservative, religious, and dogged in her pursuit of excellence. She was a commoner who married into a title, and now she's a widow. So you have to understand that Julien chose her woman very, very wisely. And he's just so doggedly pursuing this meaningless correspondence, to the point where he just churns out these letters without even comprehending what is written in them. And at one point there's a reference to, I was in London thinking of you, and he doesn't change London to whatever city he was in at that point. And this woman is so clueless that she's just like, wow, he must be so in love with me and so distracted that he thinks he's in London. So do you see how even in this little tiny episode, Stendhal tells us we see in love what we want to see in love, because it's so hard for us to step outside of ourselves, even when we are incredibly committed to stepping outside these borders that we create for ourselves, these margins, to understand the other human being. And the miracle of The Red and the Black is that it happens for Madame de Renal and Julien. It just happens for the two of them. They extend themselves into the other. And so if it's so incomprehensible to us why Julien just wants to be left alone in jail to fantasize during those happy weeks, months that he had with Madame de Renal at Vergy, the stepping outside of himself never happened with Matilda. And it happened with Madame de Renal. They were willing to forgo who they were for the sake of each other. And they gave each other their souls. And it was just this implausible romance that became ever so much more. It was passion, obsession, love. It was that thing that Stendhal tried to explain. Can you imagine writing a treatise on love? He tried to explain the mechanism of what happens to human beings when they fall in love. So first you notice how she picks a flower, or how she ties her bonnet, and then you start searching for qualities in yourself that the person who picks that flower that way and the person who ties her bonnet that way may find appealing. And then beyond that, you start focusing your attention on that human being. And then instead of just noticing, it's fascinating, that's how she drinks coffee. And then you start looking at the person's flaws and finding them charming and unique. You start being so infatuated with a human being that you look at, there's one thing that happens in Anna Karenina. There's one woman who looks at her husband's ears and they stick out, and she cannot accept his flaw. So do you see, like, all of Anna Karenina can be just read through Stendhal's view of love. And she sees those ears and she's like, oh, his ears stick out. So you can see the death knell of that relationship already in that one sign, because Stendhal says, we just start being so enamored of this person that, like, the strangest things that they do we find incredibly appealing. And then comes obsession and madness and love and desire of possession. And it's fascinating how with Matilda, Julien's relationship follows all of those stages. But it just, at one point he says, if I continue doing this, I will regain her love in 5 or 6 years. And I laughed so hard when that happened, because I just felt that we are almost at the end of the novel. We don't have 5 or 6 years. Come on, Julien, just, find something that she does. Find those morning clothes that she wears for Boniface de la Mole. So appealing that's the one thing, the one thing that will block everything about her. But it just doesn't happen. And so his resignation, it's a young man who is in his early 20s who is resigned to die because he experienced the greatest love of his life, and he knows that was the greatest love of his life, and it will never happen again. It's Stendhal. It's very hard for me to talk about this novel because I sensed all this when I read it when I was a teenager, and I was just so blown away by it. I'm not a boy. Julien is a boy, and he did his boy growing up, and he made all of the mistakes. But that's the thing about Stendhal. He makes his characters empathetic, and they step outside of the period when he creates them. Because when I was reading that book, I just was thinking, wow, I have no experience in life. So Julien Sorel. Wow, stuff happens to you in life and things don't go according to plan. Who knew? Like when you are 16, 17, you don't have too many points of reference. And Stendhal depicts this constant sense of you achieving something and then everything collapsing, and then you inching towards something and then it not working out so beautifully, that this sort of letting go and release and then a closing down happens to Julien over and over and over again, that as a young reader, you are reading about his trials and tribulations. And it's fascinating. Older readers find him intolerable, find him just so incredibly annoying, like, how stupid can you be? But then you just have to remember that you were that person once, that you made so many mistakes. You still make mistakes. You still end up, bumping into situations where you feel that I'm never going to extricate myself out of this, and this is going to destroy me. But as we get older, we just sort of create an armor around ourselves, right? We, like, oh, another thing goes bust. But when you are 18, 16, it's impossible to know that recovery is possible. Another character in Anna Karenina has the same thing happen to her. She has to go through a tremendous disappointment, not to realize that tremendous disappointments are fun, but that you can recover from a tremendous disappointment. Do you remember a certain character in War and Peace? Just like volume 2 of War and Peace is fun, but incomprehensible. Why do we have to go through 300 pages of a seduction of a character who is stupid because this character should know better? But then when we get into volume 3 and we see what that character has to suffer through, volume 2 makes sense, because that character has to know that you can go through tremendous disappointment and recover. And you have no point of reference for that when you are 16 or 17. That's why teenage suicides happen so often. You become so incredibly desperate. You get to the point of such tremendous incomprehension of how you will recover from it, because you have no memory, you have no understanding of how recovery happens. And that's why the story of Julien Sorel was so appealing to me, because it tells you all the things that can go wrong. And it's a really great novel to read about how you can't do what he does. He resigns himself to the end. And it is shocking to me. Like reading, and several of you commented on the fact that the last, 10, 15 chapters were so hard to get through. The psychology of this character is beyond belief. And we sort of go with him through all of the stages of renunciation of life. And we can pound on the book all we like, and we can, smack it against the wall and say, oh, I just want to go into that cell and just tell Julien, like, get out, fight. You're going to be 30 and 40 and 50 and 60. Let me catch my breath. That's a line from Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, right? And he just actually says, oh, I want to, who lives till 60, 70? Only scoundrels and stupid people do. But I want to live to 50, 60, 70. And then he says, let me catch my breath. I mean, you literally want to read Notes from Underground to Julien and say, see, this person is the extension of you. This person understands just how awful he is. And he just hurls his awfulness at you. And Julien is like, no, I want to go back to that cave where I was happy. I want to be that wanderer above the sea of clouds. Do you remember that painting of Friedrich that I posted at one point? It's it's Julien at the end too. He's standing above the sea of clouds. He's standing above life. He wants to be above life. He just doesn't want to get mucked up by life. And it's a very young person thing to do. They encounter just how awful life is, and they say, I don't want that awfulness to touch me. I want to remain pure. I don't want to be befouled by life. And there's wisdom to being befouled by life, but we are not the same person that we were when we walked in the water of life when we were 16, and we were not too terribly disappointed by it. So that's the beauty of Stendhal. He tells us so much about ourselves that we do not want to know. That is partly the reason why people don't finish this book. They do not want to know. It's hard to have that. And Stendhal, he says that a novel is a mirror carried along the highway, right? And it keeps swaying, and it keeps showing you things that you don't want to see. It keeps showing you too much mud. You know, every once in a while you have the reflection of glorious sunshine and azure blue sky, and then boom, a pothole again. That's life. We do not want to know that. We don't want to believe in that. But if we don't want to believe in that, we are Julian Sorel, and we just resign ourselves to ending it at 23. In so many ways, it's a novel about a suicide. Yeah, he's executed. He's guillotined at the end of the novel, but he is resisting appeal so passionately because he just wants to end it. He does not want to be sullied by life. And it's a stunning novel to read when you're a teenager, because it tells you that you know, like there's more. You need more. You want more. And that's why we hate Julian Sorel so much, but we love him so much because we want to tell him thank you. You do not want to go there, and he does. And you know, it chokes you up to read those final chapters. The psychology is so complex. The psychology is just so brutal. And he keeps saying to himself, look, Napoleon resigned himself. You know, he was exiled to St. Helena in 1815, and he died in 1821. And Julien keeps reminding himself, you know, for 6 years, he did something. Can you imagine being Napoleon and sitting on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, having 6 years, hour after hour, minute after minute, second after second, to reassess his life? It's maddening. And Julien says, I can't do it because I'm not Napoleon. And who of us is? And it's amazing. You know, Napoleon is dead in 1821. All of the books we're reading were written past the point of his presence on Earth. And every single one of these books just can't let go of him, because he was so much for so many people and so much for France. And that's why I just doggedly keep reposting all of my notes on Napoleon before every one of our books, because without that, we really can't appreciate just the genius and the commitment of these authors to understanding the complexity of this time period. So I think that's pretty much all I had to say. I'm just going to look at my note here. That's about it. Ready to cry because this novel is so beautiful. It slays me each time. And those of you who read more Brothers Karamazov than more Dostoevsky than Brothers Karamazov. Those of you who read Crime and Punishment, I mean, it's just staggering to do the comparison of those final chapters of Julien's internal monologue, and then read Crime and Punishment and know that Dostoevsky knew it. And both Tolstoy and Dostoevsky witnessed the guillotining in Paris. And with Tolstoy, that was the beginning of his route towards pacifism. I mean, he was in his 20s, and, you know, he didn't reflect on that immediately. But eventually he will be a firm opponent of the abolition of capital punishment. And Dostoevsky will witness a guillotining in Paris in his 30s, and he would be stunned by it. And so much of his crime fiction will be informed by the fact that France was this weird place where they did public executions all the way into the middle of the 19th century. It's just incomprehensible. You know, this sophisticated France that we love so much, that had this death obsession and death as a performance obsession that dates all the way to the Reign of Terror period. Was one more thing that I was going to mention about France, but oh well. Let's take questions if there are any.
Yeah, well, as I had just dropped in the chat, if folks have questions, they can put them in the chat and I'm happy to ask them, or you can use the raise hand function and ask them yourself. We've got one from Terry here. She says, I admired Matilda's courage and like to think of her poise and dignity at the end of the novel. She's taking her place in her family's saga, and she will no doubt return in 100 years on the heart of some young descendant of hers.
I mean, that moment where she like lops off half her hair and just kind of drops half. I mean, she has these gorgeous locks. And can you imagine how much hair falls into the lap of Julianne? And you wonder, like, what's this madness? I mean, they're very young. She's a teenager and he's like barely out of his teens. But you have to understand Matilda's motivations. She can't stand her class. She just despises her class because they marched off to be executed by nobodies, and none of them put up any resistance. She cannot comprehend how an entire class with a history that goes back to the Crusades just marched off to have their heads chopped off with complete resignation to their fate. And it's shocking that Julianne just sort of becomes a member of her class who marches off to his execution without putting up a fight. And Matilda is such a complicated character. She would love to fall into Julianne's arms, but it's not just aristocratic snobbery. Can you imagine being Matilda whose ancestors fought in the Crusades? Can you imagine being Matilda whose ancestors served the kings of France? She is proud, she's haughty, and she is the extension of centuries of French aristocratic pride. And all of a sudden, she looks at the boys, the young men of her class, and they are meaningless to her because they are the offsprings of these people who just died for nothing. Didn't even think that the principles that were essential to their class are worth defending against an uprising of unwashed masses. And then all of a sudden, a member of the unwashed masses walks into her life, and she finds him endlessly more fascinating than the young man of her class. Her conflict is unresolvable. But then she just, at one point, she says, I'm committed to him to the end. It doesn't matter what, because the young men of my class are pathetic. And shocking to us. And just think, and do you remember how often Stendhal mentions a revolution is coming, a revolution is coming, a revolution is coming, wake up everyone. I mean, Madame de Renal says, oh gosh, I have to pay these exorbitant amounts of money to my servants in the hope that if the next revolution comes, they're not going to cut my throat in my sleep. And then she says to Julianne, if I die before you, take care of my children, because you are a representative of the class that will be making the revolution happen. So think kindly of them as an extension of me. And, of course, she succumbs to her love for Julianne, and she cannot live. And Julianne cannot live because he cannot fight. He just does not want to fight. And without him, her life is meaningless. And then Matilda, who seems to be, a frilly, heroic girl who loves to write, loves to read sort of romanticized version of her family's history, she becomes heroic. She just, she's committed to him to the very end. And that final scene was that little marble table. I mean, wow. And then she creates a shrine, and she carries his remains into that little cave where he felt complete. And it's the epitome of romanticism, this realism and this foreshadowing of a revolution to come. That's one side of Stendhal, but the epitome of romanticism is his remains are buried in the spot where he was one with himself and he was one with nature when life still made sense to him. Perfect book for a 16-year-old.
Well, our next question ties in very well with that. Barbara had said, can you speak a bit about Stendhal's decision to have Matilda be the woman who is still alive and mourning Julian at the end rather than Madame Renal? That left me with the impression that Matilda was really the more important female character.
I wish he would have written the green and the pink, or the pink and the green. I wish he would have finished that novel, because Minna seems like the kind of character, haughty, aristocratic, and she is Prussian, so she's German speaking, and she's a Protestant, and it's fascinating that this French aristocrat who is interested in her, he's a Catholic. So Stendhal definitely wants to play with the complexity of religious relationships in Europe, because remember, Matilda de la Mole's ancestor, Boniface de la Mole, comes from that period where the French Protestants and the French Catholics didn't get along. They kind of wanted to murder each other a lot. And so that Marguerite of Navarre, who is the lover of Boniface de la Mole, who carries his executed head and buries it, she is the wife of Henry, the future Henry IV of France, who was a Protestant but converted to Catholicism in order to be of the religion that is the majority of his subjects. And so that basically calms down the relationships between the Protestants and the Catholics, because they get a Protestant king who converts to Catholicism in order to be the king of all French. And so at that point, France's Reformation wars are not as devastating as Germany's Reformation wars, which saw the death of 30% of the German speakers in Europe. It was just catastrophic. And it all ends in 1648 was the dissolution of United Germany, not to rise again till 1870 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. So Matilda is a character that is a survivor. You wouldn't have thought of that, but she's a teenager who just pulls herself out of the doldrums and just lives her convictions. And it's fascinating. Julien doesn't trust her. I mean, Julien has his class's distrust of the aristocrats, right? And he tells Madame de Renal that when her child is born, she'll forget about him and she'll marry the Croisenois, and then this child will be discarded. But it's fascinating. The Croisenois goes to fight for her honor in a duel and dies in a duel. So we like lose 3 characters at the end of the novel. And it's Matilda who is a survivor. We don't know whether she kept the child. We don't even know if the child was delivered, but she lives her convictions. And the one thing that stuck with me when I read it, and when I was 16, is her riding in the carriage with that object on her lap, all the way to the place where he wanted to be buried. And there's something gruesomely heroic about her, but you think like, ooh, it's like, one, her hero, Marguerite of Navarre, did the same thing. And 2, everyone was beheaded in France in the past few decades. I mean, they had 20,000, 25,000 guillotined executions. And that's why I posted the plot of the Symphonie Fantastique of Berlioz. So in the first movement, it's like this dreamy, romantic young man who is obsessed with a woman, and he sort of sees snippets of her in this idée fixe motif that follows him through all of his internal introspections. In the second movement, they go to a ball, and he sees her just disappearing here and there, and her motif is incorporated into this endlessly haunting waltz. And then he just follows her everywhere. And just at the moment of attainment, she slips out of his reach. And so in the next movement, he goes to the countryside and she appears as a howling she-wolf. And so you have to read the plot. Like this weekend, please read the plot of Symphonie Fantastique and then overlay Julien Sorel's relationship with Matilda on it. And then in the fourth movement, he is so obsessed with this woman that he murders her. And then, of course, he is sentenced to death. And at the end of the fourth movement, I mean, like Berlioz was insane. He actually writes the music for the rolling of the head. And the link that I gave you was for Leonard Bernstein conducting, I think, the New York Philharmonic. And you have to watch his facial expression, Leonard Bernstein's facial expression when he's conducting the very end of the fourth movement, because he knows, and he's like, oh yeah, and the head is rolling, everyone, yay. And then brief pause, and the fifth movement, which is like a witch's Sabbath, and it's the afterlife. And in the afterlife, this character is haunted by the beloved, and she becomes a cackling witch. And you will recognize that music because it's used in so many horror films. It has this incredible violin section that, you know, reminds you like of the music of Jaws and so many horror music scores. And so please listen to the entirety of Symphonie Fantastique this weekend and actually watch Leonard Bernstein conducting it. Watch his facial expressions, priceless at the end of the fourth movement, but read the plot first. And these two authors, a composer and a writer, who captured the essence of the moment of 1830 in France, because Symphonie Fantastique is first performed in 1830, and it's about Berlioz's obsessive relationship with an English actress that she didn't hear it at first, and then she heard it in London, and she was like, oh my God, that's about me. So, they got married, and it was a disaster. She was a Shakespearean actress, and he married his muse, and didn't turn out well for him at all. But they're neighbors in the Montmartre Cemetery. So if you ever go to Paris, like skip the tourist attractions, go to the Montmartre Cemetery and say hello to Stendhal. And when I was there were like books placed. His books were placed on his tombstone. There was a few stones sitting on them so that the wind wouldn't blow them away. I was stunned. I was just absolutely stunned. I mean, the worship of Stendhal among the Stendhal fans is admirable and endless.
All right. Well, we didn't have any other comments or questions. If folks have any, they certainly can drop in, or we are at the top of the hour. So, I guess we do have one last one here that dropped in. Eve says, it struck me several times while reading that Julien might have fared better in his love of Matilda had he not treated it as a battle. The prevalence of military metaphors and language was quite overdone.
Right. He treats his relationship with Madame de Renal the same way. But eventually it extends beyond that. It extends with Madame de Renal to the merging of their souls, which is why that relationship is so rewarding for both of them, and why Julien, all he wants to think about is the happiness he had with her at her country house at Vergy. With Mathilde, I think she likes the militancy of this constant battling between them. And, he raises a sword against her, which is so weird. I know that some of you commented, okay, young ladies, stay away from this guy. He runs around with swords, and he runs around with pistols, and he is just a little deranged. And it's true. He's completely obsessive. But it's fascinating that Matilda is the one who writes the letter first, which is really shocking. She's so infatuated with him. And I love the fact that the romance blossoms in the library. And it's just, that's where he's supposed to work. His desk is in the Chateau library. And that's where she can find him at all times, just doing something for her dad. And so it's a great pretext for her to come. She's like, oh, I just, need the next volume of, my favorite French Enlightenment thinker. And so, and he notices always that she's reading all the novels that are the no-no novels. He wants to read the next tome of some Enlightenment thinker. And it's like, Matilda must have taken it. So it's yet another faction or another segment of their relationship. Their relationship is through the books that she reads. And it's fascinating that with Madame de Renal, the relationship is much more natural. And I know that John commented on this, that reading books is dangerous. And so Madame de Renal and Julien's relationship was so much more natural, because if they would have read romance novels, or if they would have gone to theater, they would have understood their roles. Oh, she's the married woman and he's the young lover. And so this is our next step. But because they did not go to the theater and did not read novels, their relationship evolved slowly and naturally. And with Matilda, both of them have these expectations. He needs the heroic, she needs the heroic, but both of their expectations of heroic are so unattainable that they are missing each other. They are missing this merging of each other's souls, which do happen with Madame de Renal, because even though the relationship is just so oddly mismatched, then it just would be so much more natural for Julien to, make a commitment to Matilda. And, they are on the verge of getting married, which is stunning. And eventually he attains his military uniform, and he is attached to a military unit. And, the guys, despite the fact that he hasn't been doing it since childhood, start respecting him because he has this natural courage, natural bravado. But I think both Matilda and Julien have an expectation of this complex romance. And I think in so many ways, it's weirdly gratified for both of them.
Great. All right. Well, I think that brings us to a close, unless anyone had any final thoughts, or if you have any final thoughts, Anna.
I love Stendhal. It's like, it's just never ceasing. I've read this novel so many times. I read it in my 20s and in my 30s, and just going through it like line by line now was miraculous. And I still have I told you so much about this novel, and I still have nothing to say about this novel. Like everything that I said is meaningless because this novel, literally for me, is like a gasp. It just says so much about humanity that cannot be expressed in words. It's a very wise novel, incredibly wise novel about what it means to be a human being, and it's a very early 19th century novel. You have to understand that all the greats, George Eliot and Dickens and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Hugo, they wrote in the shadow of Stendhal. So that's why reading this early novel, this text of the 19th century novelistic genre, was so gratifying to me because we looked at it and its place in the history of 19th century novels. And I just gave you a little hint of why Stendhal is so important in the life of Tolstoy, because I might actually just assign that everyone should read On Love before we read Anna Karenina, because so much, Tolstoy learns so much from Stendhal. And he actually attributes, there's a scene, those of you who read War and Peace with me, do you remember the scene of an amputation and how incredibly complex that scene is in the life of one of the characters, where he learns empathy. He learns to understand another human being, and he learns about this merging of souls at a moment of empathy. That comes from both The Red and the Black and the Charterhouse of Parma. There's one line amputation scene in the Charterhouse of Parma, and Tolstoy takes that and adds everything else that Stendhal understands about the human condition and about the psychology of human beings and the complexity of what it means to be a human being, and turns it into a scene that reduces all of us to tears, no matter how many times we touch that. So, we are just on a march through French and English literature until we feel like we are well armed to tackle Anna Karenina, which Tolstoy felt was his most European novel. And we'll do that in the fall of 23. And then beyond that, Tolstoy is going to be 200 in 2028. So stick around. I'm already plotting what to do for that. It will be big, obnoxious, loud. There'll be opera and ballet, and just going to make it the funnest literary year that extends into everything else that was touched by Tolstoy. Then I retire. and then I'll travel through Italy, carrying the Rome, Naples, and Florence book of Stendhal, and just sit on ruins and contemplate eternity. And then I'll start writing, and it's like, and at that moment, I decided to write my autobiography. And I'll be just as phony as Stendhal, but that's why we love him. He's the most delightfully real phony in our literary lives, and we are grateful to him for all of the wisdom he shared with us. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Anna. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. And we'll see everyone in June for the next installment. So take care and enjoy your weekend.
Viva France.